Hello, welcome. My name is Leslie Lara Enriquez, Principal Public Information Officer at ABAG and MTC. I want to welcome you to this pre-recorded webinar where you can learn more about the environmental impact assessment process that we are kicking off for Plan Bay Area 2050. To start off, I want to provide you with an overview of today's agenda. I'm joined by my colleagues Adam Nolting and Chirag Rabari, who will lead today's presentation. They will provide an overview of Plan Bay Area 2050 and the draft environmental impact report process required under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. And we will end the webinar with information on how to submit written comments to help inform the scope and content of the environmental impact report for Plan Bay Area 2050. So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague Chirag Rabari, who will lead the first part of the presentation. Chirag?
Thank you, Leslie, and hello, everyone. My name is Chirag Rabari, Principal with the Regional Planning Program at MTC and ABAG. We have two primary objectives for the presentation we will be giving here. First is to provide an overview of Plan Bay Area 2050, and second is to review key elements of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, as well as the associated EIR process. In particular, we will discuss the kinds of feedback we are looking for from the scoping process as prescribed by CEQA, as well as the overall timeline for the Plan Bay Area 2050 EIR. Plan Bay Area 2050 is a long-range plan charting the course for the future of the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area. The plan will focus on 4 key issues: transportation, housing, the environment, and the economy, and will identify a path to make the Bay Area more equitable for all residents and more resilient in the face of unexpected challenges, such as sea level rise. The purpose of the new regional plan will be to outline integrated strategies for growth and investment through the year 2050. The plan will also identify regional transportation planning needs, priorities, and funding, affordable housing needs and revenues, as well as revenues to support select economic development and environmental resilience strategies. In accordance with state and federal planning requirements, the preparation of an EIR for this plan is a joint effort of MTC and ABAG. MTC is the Transportation Planning, Coordinating, and Financing Agency for the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area. MTC functions as both the Regional Transportation Planning Agency, which is a state designation, and as the region's Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a federal designation. As required by state legislation and by federal regulation, MTC is responsible for preparing a Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP, for the San Francisco Bay Area. ABAG serves as the comprehensive regional planning agency and council of governments for the region. ABAG is a public entity created by local governments to meet their planning and research needs related to land use and is responsible under state law to conduct the regional housing needs allocation process. Regional transportation planning, local land use planning, and regional housing allocations are more closely aligned because of the passage of California's Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act, or SB 375, which was signed into law in 2008. MTC and ABAG are jointly required by SB 375 to develop a Sustainable Community Strategy, or SCS, that accompanies the RTP. Plan Bay Area 2050 is designed to serve as the region's 2021 RTP SCS. Plan should support the reduction of per capita passenger vehicle-generated greenhouse gas emissions by identifying policies and strategies that integrate land use and transportation planning. Plan Bay Area 2050 will meet the requirements of SB 375 by attaining or exceeding a per capita GHG emissions reduction target of 19% by year 2035 from 2005 levels, as established for the Bay Area by the California Air Resources Board. In September 2020, MTC and ABAG adopted the revised strategies and growth geographies that will serve as the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050, and also adopted a regional growth forecast for the region. While Plan Bay Area 2050 seeks to meet or exceed federal and state planning requirements, it is also designed to offer a more aspirational vision of what the San Francisco Bay Area could become. MTC and ABAG conducted a months-long outreach and engagement effort to determine the most pressing issues that should be considered as the agency's plan for life in 2050. In September 2019, ABAG and MTC adopted resolutions affirming the following vision for the plan: to ensure that the Bay Area is affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant for all by the year 2050. Plan Bay Area 2050 Regional Growth Forecast identifies how much the Bay Area might grow between 2015 and 2050, including population, jobs, household, and associated housing units. The forecast also includes important components of that growth, including employment by sector, population by age, and race ethnic characteristics, and households by income level. As shown on the slide, Plan Bay Area 2050 forecasts the Bay Area will add over 2.7 million people, 1.4 million new jobs, 1.4 million new households, and 1.5 million new housing units between 2015 and 2050. In September 2020, MTC and ABAG approved and adopted this regional growth forecast. It's also important to note this forecast was revised earlier this year to integrate the significant adverse impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and 2020 recession on the first decade of the planning period. To plan for this future growth and meet the greenhouse gas emissions reductions target established pursuant to SB 375, Plan Bay Area 2050 identifies specific areas prioritized for new housing and jobs, known as growth geographies. For housing, growth geographies include priority development areas, transit-rich areas, and high-resource areas. For jobs, growth geographies include priority production areas, priority development areas, and transit-rich areas. These growth geographies build on local and regional planning efforts and include 216 locally nominated PDAs and 36 locally nominated PPAs within the 9-county Bay Area. The plan also includes 184 locally nominated priority conservation areas. Although not a designated growth geography, PCAs are areas of regional significance that have broad community support for conservation and need environmental protection. They provide important agricultural, natural resource, scenic, cultural, recreational, and/or ecological values, as well as ecosystem functions. Plan Bay Area 2050 also includes a financially constrained transportation investment plan pursuant to RTP SCS requirements as defined by state and federal planning regulations. It includes transportation projects and programs that would be funded through existing and future revenues that are projected to be reasonably available to the region over the horizon of the plan to support the adopted growth pattern. A total of $466 billion in existing revenues is available for the financially constrained Plan Bay Area 2050, and at least $113 billion in new revenues has also been identified. Although not required by state and federal RTP SCS requirements, Plan Bay Area 2050 has also identified funding needs and revenues for affordable housing, as well as revenues to support select economic development and environmental resilience strategies. The housing element includes $122 billion in existing funding, as well as $346 billion in new revenues. The economy element includes $234 billion in new revenues. And the environment element includes $15 billion in existing funding and $87 billion in new revenues. To advance the Plan Bay Area 2050 and meet or exceed state and federal planning requirements, including state-mandated GHG emissions reduction target, these existing and anticipated revenues will support 35 integrated strategies defined as policies or bundles of investments across the 4 core elements of the plan. These strategies are clustered under 11 key themes. The 35 strategies cover a lot of ground and include everything from building a complete streets network and to expanding and modernizing the regional rail network, further strengthening renter protections beyond state legislation, and building adequate affordable housing to ensure homes for all, implementing a statewide universal basic income and investing in high-speed internet in underserved low-income communities, adapting to sea level rise, as well as modernizing and expanding parks, trails, and recreation facilities, among many others. Plan Bay Area 2050 is required by state mandates to accommodate future growth in a more sustainable manner by reducing per capita GHG emissions and providing adequate housing for the region's projected population growth at all income levels. To determine whether the plan is on track to achieve its vision, MTC and ABAG developed 2 questions for each of the plan's guiding principles. These questions are accompanied by draft metrics that are intended to aid in the analysis of the plan's performance. In addition to the required per capita GHG emissions reductions, metrics look at housing and transportation costs, households and jobs within a half-mile of frequent transit neighborhoods experiencing gentrification and displacement, and growth in the number of jobs, among others. I will now hand it over to my colleague Adam Nolting, who will provide an overview of the CEQA and the EIR process for Plan Bay Area 2050. Adam?
Thank you, Chirag, and hello, everyone. I am Adam Nolting, a principal planner with the Regional Planning Program and the project manager for the Plan Bay Area 2050 EIR. In accordance with the California Environmental Quality Act, commonly referred to as CEQA, and the CEQA guidelines, MTC and ABAG will lead the preparation of an Environmental Impact Report, or EIR for short, for Plan Bay Area 2050. In general, the purposes of the EIR are to analyze and disclose the potential range of environmental effects of implementing the plan, inform decision makers, agencies, and the public of the range of possible environmental impacts of implementing the plan, and recommend measures to mitigate significant adverse impacts, and analyze reasonable alternatives to the plan. The EIR will assess and disclose the potential environmental effects of implementing the strategies encompassing the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050, adopted by MTC and ABAG in September and outlined by Chirag. Specifically, the EIR will assess the potential direct and indirect environmental impacts of implementing the regional pattern of household and employment growth and implementing the transportation and resilience investments. The EIR will present a programmatic assessment of Plan Bay Area 2050, focusing on the set of strategies or projects encompassing the final blueprint. Individual strategy or project impacts will not be addressed in detail. Rather, the focus of the EIR will be on Plan Bay Area 2050's entire program of strategies and projects. While the analysis in the EIR will not assess project-specific impacts of individual strategies or projects, the EIR will provide environmental analysis and mitigation that is intended to address the range of impacts and mitigation that may be associated with individual projects. This EIR will not relieve local jurisdictions of responsibility for determining whether project-specific impacts require additional CEQA analysis. The CEQA Environmental Checklist form, commonly referred to as Appendix G, identifies a list of environmental factors that could be potentially affected by implementing the strategies encompassing the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050. For each environmental factor, there are significance criterion or thresholds to determine whether Plan Bay Area 2050's implementation would lead to a significant effect on the environment. These environmental factors represent chapters or sections of the EIR. An NOP, or Notice of Preparation, informs the public of the lead agency's intent to prepare an EIR and seeks comments about its scope and content. The NOP for Plan Bay Area 2050 was released September 28th, kicking off a 30-day public comment period. MTC and ABAG are particularly interested in hearing from parties on the following two questions. Are there alternatives to the strategies in the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050 that MTC and ABAG should evaluate? And what mitigation measures would help avoid or minimize potential environmental effects? The purpose of the scoping meeting is to provide an opportunity for interested parties to make suggestions regarding the scope and content of the EIR analyses. The scoping meeting provides an opportunity to receive public and agency input on environmental issues, feasible alternatives, and potential mitigation measures that may warrant in-depth analysis in the environmental review process. A virtual public scoping meeting will be held Thursday, October 15th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. You can register for the meeting via the Plan Bay Area website. Attendees of the scoping meeting will be able to provide oral and written comments. Comments received during public scoping are considered in preparing the draft EIR. In general, the scoping meeting focuses on environmental issues related to implementing the strategies encompassing the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050. CEQA requires the EIR to identify and study a range of reasonable alternatives to the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050. The primary goal of an alternative is to mitigate or avoid significant impacts of implementing the plan. The alternatives to the final blueprint will accommodate the same levels of forecasted regional household and employment growth, but will consider different strategies that could alter the regional growth pattern and alter the types of transportation and/or resilience investments. One alternative is required by CEQA and is commonly referred to as the no project alternative. The purpose of the no project alternative is to allow a comparison of the potential environmental impacts of implementing the plan with the effects of not implementing it. This alternative represents a regional growth pattern and transportation system if the strategies encompassing the final blueprint are not implemented. MTC and ABAG will develop EIR alternatives during the remainder of 2020. MTC and ABAG will prepare an initial set of alternatives and will consider alternatives identified during the scoping process. Once a range of alternatives are identified, MTC and ABAG will then conduct a screening process to arrive at a reasonable range of alternatives for evaluation in the EIR. There are generally three factors for consideration of an alternative from a CEQA perspective. Will the alternative potentially avoid or lessen significant impacts of the project? Can the alternative attain most of the project objectives? Is the alternative reasonably feasible? Alternatives anticipated to address these three factors will be considered for further analysis in the EIR. There are a number of key milestones occurring over the next 11 months. This fall, MTC and ABAG are soliciting comments about the scope and content of the EIR. Into the winter, MTC and ABAG will identify and screen alternatives to the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050. And in the spring of 2021, MTC and ABAG will release a draft EIR for public review in order to receive comments on the adequacy of the EIR. Finally, in summer of 2021, MTC and ABAG will prepare a final EIR that will consist of changes to the draft EIR and written responses to comments submitted during the draft EIR comment period. I will now turn it back over to Leslie. Leslie.
Thank you, Adam. We invite interested agencies, organizations, and individuals to submit written comments to help us inform the scope and content of the environmental impact assessment for Plan Bay Area 2050. We are particularly interested, as Adam mentioned, in hearing your views on the following questions. Are there any alternatives you believe MTC should evaluate? And what types of mitigation measures do you think would help avoid or minimize potential environmental effects? You can submit detailed written comments in any of the following three ways: by email to eircomments@bayareametro.gov, that's eircomments@bayareametro.gov. You can also use the online form available on our website at planbayarea.org. Navigate to the 2050 Plan tab on our website, click Environmental Impact Report, and then click on the EIR Scoping Meetings link on the left-hand side of the navigation menu. The direct URL to the online form is also here on your screen. And last, you can send your written comments via postal mail to MTC Public Information with attention EIR comments to our address at 375 Beale Street, Suite 800, San Francisco, California, 94105. The mailing address is on screen as well. The deadline to submit comments is Wednesday, October 28, 2020. Thank you for watching our pre-recorded webinar to learn more about Plan Bay Area 2050 and the environmental impact assessment process. Have a great day.